If you are joining us for the first time, hello and welcome. If you're a returning supporter and friend, welcome back. This is Unboxing Economics. Today we'll be taking a look back at an almost 400-year-old example of perhaps the first economic crisis and market bubble, and perhaps the first government bailout. These events, sometimes referred to as Tulip mania, took place in the Netherlands in the early 17th century, where a tulip bulb was valued at that similar to that of a house in downtown Amsterdam. This valuation did not last long, of course, and then led to a major and rapid decline in price, leading to one of the first boom-bust cycles in economic history. We will take a look back at a brief history pre the bubble, why tulips became so popular and valuable, what happened in the midst of the bubble, what was the fallout of the crisis, and of course a few lessons for today. Let's get straight into it. Tulips were introduced to Europe from the East in the 16th century. An early supporter of and tulip enthusiast was Charles de Cluse, a botanist who improved and changed some of the genetic makeup of the tulips to make them bigger, brighter, more varied, more colourful, more magnificent, and therefore more sought after. De Cluse's work led to the more revered species of the tulip, Semio Augustus, which was praised for its stripe-like appearance and bold lines of multiple colours, typically white and red. This striped pattern was later discovered to be the result of not engineering, but a plant virus. Semio Augustus is now extinct, perhaps due to this very virus. We have only artists' impression of what the tulip could have looked like. These artists never likely saw the actual flower whilst in bloom. The popularity of tulips spread throughout the Netherlands. This was for several reasons. Firstly, they were beautiful, new, and unique. Secondly, they were a status symbol to those who could afford them. They took some time to grow and considerable skill to grow. There was a growing and prosperous middle class throughout the Netherlands of this time, due in part to the Dutch Golden Age. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, at a social level, the growing middle class was very limited in ways in which they could display their wealth. Because of the influence of the church and Christianity on the population at the time, it was thought they could only display their wealth in ways that helped display the glory of God. Naturally, tulips met this criteria. Tulips continued to become very popular over the next several decades. As the popularity grew, tulip bulbs went up in price. Bulbs could previously only be traded post-harvest in June and pre-planting, roughly September, the off-season, if you will. Because of the seasonality of the flower and the time frame, a secondary market was created to trade futures contracts for tulip bulbs, whereby two parties will agree that one party would buy the tulip bulb and the other party would provide the tulip bulb at a future date at a predetermined price. And thus began the process of investment, or more accurately, speculation. These transactions took place in a local bar or pub, which later became known as colleges. These colleges took a fee of 2.5% of the face value of the contract. Over the next few years, the popularity of these contracts continued to grow, as did the popularity of tulips. Greater price of tulip bulbs led to more speculation, and more speculation led to more price increases. The dramatic increase in price started in November 1636 up until the peak and the eventual bursting of this bubble in early February 1637. There were several different markets that existed at any given time. Each species of bulb had a separate market, and each type went up significantly. However, the more exclusive the bulb, the greater the increase. Prices on average increased between 1,000 and 2,000% in the 18 months leading up to the peak of February 1637. The most exclusive bulb, Semio Augustus, mentioned earlier, was traded at a high of 5,000 guilders, which is roughly the cost of a luxury home downtown Amsterdam at the time. These contracts were simply paper-based contracts, a promise to trade at a future date, or harvest in this case. The promise lies in the idea of traders having very little link to the actual farmer. In many cases, traders, both the buyer and the seller of these contracts, had no idea about farming or tulips. They had no idea, in many cases, where the physical bulbs were planted, and most importantly, typically had no intention of holding the contracts until maturity. Many traders were speculating. They could buy the contract in anticipation of selling that same contract to another party at a profit before maturity. Like many bubbles in history, this attitude was widespread and profitable whilst it worked. In terms of the eventual correction, there was some dispute as to why this happened. Some consider it simply a jolt back to reality of people who suddenly woke up to the distance between their previous fair value and the contract's price paid. An alternative explanation is that once the tulips started to break through the surface of the soil, it became abundantly clear that supply would be far greater than the demand. Thus, many of the contracts entered into were significantly overvalued, leading to a sharp decline in the market almost overnight. Bear in mind the number of tulips that were available to harvest was unknown until just before the tulips were picked. In economics, a theory of a bubble is an economic cycle that is characterized by a rapid escalation of market price. This fast ascent is followed by a quick decrease in value or contraction, sometimes referred to as a crash or the bubble bursting. This to the latter is what happened in Amsterdam in the 1630s. Some historians consider the events of tulip mania, whilst definitely a bubble, not to be an economic crisis for the following reasons. Number one, very few people were involved in the market. The traders was a very small group compared to the population of the city. Post-bubble bursting, the Dutch authorities did intervene. They ordered a debt cancellation order, stating that only the margin or down payment of the contract is collectible upon contract maturity. This was typically 10% of the face value. Some specific contracts were deemed null and void by the authorities. Moreover, many people involved in these markets had several positions in many different bulb markets, and in many cases, money owed to participants, whilst significant, was somewhat offset by money owed by those same people. This is another reason the crisis did not spread throughout the economy, as it otherwise might have been expected to. Looking back at this from a historical perspective, certain cliches do come to mind. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If it was that easy, everybody would do it. Do not invest in things you do not fully understand. Don't buy things you don't need or want with money you do not have. This was the first economic bubble, hence we can hardly blame the people involved, as for them, this was breaking new ground. Now to some good news. It seems that almost 400 years later, we as a society, and perhaps as a species, have learnt. Never since have we been involved in such gluttony or greed. We have since only acted with dignity, decorum, and virtue. And our values to our fellow human beings, as well as the planet, have mirrored and honoured this, and our economic activities ever since. We have... Wait, what? Wait, what do you mean? Wait, this sort of thing has happened again? With tulips? What do you mean it's happened heaps of times? Friends, it seems we have not learnt any lessons from history. We did indeed engage in and cause many more economic bubbles throughout the generations. In the slow and yet carefully chosen words of the former governor of the Federal Reserve of the US, Mr. Alan Greenspan, a man who was well informed of market functions and market bubbles. Some would say he created them, others would say he dealt with them, but that's a discussion for another day. Either way, he was asked at the end of the financial crisis about the future of bubbles. He said, "In the future there will be crises, but they will be different." The questions still remain. Why do we as people refuse to not learn from mistakes of the past? Maybe a bit of ignorance, maybe hubris, maybe it's different this time. This has been Unboxing Economics. Please like and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, history is more than just a bunch of stuff that happened. Thank you for watching.